Well, it wasn't a quiet weekend for Pitt at all. Plenty to talk about after the Panthers had a rather eventful weekend, a newsworthy weekend, and certainly plenty of newsworthy topics to discuss. 3 players drafted in the NFL, going to the NFL, 1 on Friday, 2 on Saturday. Pitt football landed a transfer commitment from a defensive back that they were very high on coming out of high school. Now they get an opportunity to finally coach him and have him play in Pitt's defensive system. And the basketball team had a priority transfer target on campus for a visit. A big one there to keep an eye on, one we've been talking about for weeks now, and certainly leading up to the weekend, and certainly throughout the weekend, and certainly over the next couple days, because things could get really interesting there. So we've got a lot to discuss. We're going to try and get to everything we possibly can here to get your week started. So let's jump into it on the Monday edition of the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yep, it's Monday. We're getting the week started here on the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. All kinds of things happening. Transfer news and NFL news, not recruiting news. That was really the only thing that was sort of left out here. But football transfers, basketball transfers, and NFL draft picks, and all of them I think are sort of equally interesting. I think we start with football transfers because Pitt landed a defensive back over the weekend. Jeremiah Anglin, a DB from Kentucky, originally in the recruiting class of 2023. He was a top recruiting target for Pitt in that recruiting class. So that was the class that signed last year. They were freshmen last season. Anglin didn't play as a true freshman in Kentucky because he tore his ACL in training camp and ended up having to take a red shirt. He was cleared for spring camp and ended up making a big play at a pick 6 in Kentucky's spring game. And then he went into the transfer portal shortly thereafter. We've been trying to touch base with Anglin and get him on the phone for an interview, and we hope to get that done at some point to find out about his reasons for leaving Kentucky. But I think his reasons for joining Pitt are clear. He was a high priority target for the Panthers in that 2023 recruiting class. They wanted to sign a lot of defensive backs. They signed a lot of defensive backs, and that was a class that, at various points had Shelton Lewis and Bryce Pollock in it, and they lost those guys. They ended up signing, still got Shadarian Harrison, Jesse Anderson, Cruz Brookins was a late addition to that class. Was there one other guy? I'm drawing a blank. I shouldn't draw a blank. I should know these things off the top of my head. I mean, come on. What am I doing? Am I prepared here or not? Let me look at the scholarship board real quick and see if they had another DB in that class. I remember the goal was to take 4 in that class. Anderson, Brookins, Harrison. I guess those were the 3 that they ended up signing. And now they're getting Anglin into the recruiting class, and it was somebody they really coveted. We had him rated as a high 3-star safety prospect. That was sort of the consensus ranking across the networks. Kentucky obviously liked him a lot. He's going to come to Pitt as a cornerback, though, and that's what makes him really relevant, is because we know that's where Pitt needs depth. And maybe not just depth, they need starters, is at the cornerback position. When we talked about him as being a potential safety, I think when Pitt recruited Jeremiah Anglin, they talked about him. I think the staff believed he could play corner or safety. Now, they don't need him as a safety. I mean, they've obviously, for this year, they've got Javon McIntyre, Donovan McMillan, and P.J. O'Brien, and they've got redshirt freshmen and Jesse Anderson and Cruz Brookins, who are probably going to play this year, and they'll be the future beyond that. So they don't really need safeties, but they do need corners. They've got a lot of bodies at corners. They've got a lot of guys they could go to at corner, but they don't have any returning starters, and they don't have any guys with a lot of experience. The oldest corners on the team, scholarship guys, Rashad Battle, Tamon Lynham, the transfer from Nebraska, and Javonte Royal. Royal hasn't really played at all. He's bounced back and forth between defensive back and wide receiver. Battle has played some, but he's also dealt with injuries over the last few seasons, and that's limited his playing time. And Lynham played some at Nebraska, but not a lot. Not enough that you would say, boy, he's got a lot of experience. Ditto for Noah Bigelow and Tamarian Crumpley, 2 redshirt juniors on this team. Ditto for Rylan Gandy, a redshirt sophomore on this team. And Shadarian Harrison missed all of last season. They bring in 2 freshmen in this recruiting class, Nigel Maynard and Davian Pritchard. Maynard enrolled early and participated in spring camp. Pritchard will arrive in June. But when you run down the list of those those corners, there's nobody that jumps out as an obvious starting candidate. My guess is if they had to play a game today without Anglin being on campus, it would probably be Rylan Gandy and Rashad Battle who would start. Would be my guess. Where's my draft board? Let's look at how those guys were drafted. Close the board. Obviously Battle went to his team as a senior. Rashad Battle did, and Javonte Royal as well. But once they started drafting cornerbacks, they waited quite a while, actually. Oh, Lynham was injured anyway, so it wasn't there wasn't a lot to be said there. I'm trying to find even when they drafted the corners. I'm scrolling through the list here. Rylan Gandy went first, and then Noah Bigelow, Nigel Maynard, and Tamarian Crumpley. Now, some of those guys, Harrison and Lynham, were injured, so they weren't available to be drafted. A few other guys were seniors, so they got placed on teams. Rashad Battle got placed on a team. Javonte Royal got placed on a team. But when it came time to drafting the underclassmen, it went Gandy, Bigelow, Maynard, Crumpley. So, it doesn't actually Crumpley, I guess, was probable. So that was part of the reason he slipped in the draft. But I mean, I think that's what you're looking at is probably Gandy and Battle. And there's a lot of bodies. There are 9 scholarship corners on this roster, but 3 of them are seniors. So you're also looking toward the future, which Anglin gives you 4 more years of eligibility if he lasts, for his entire college career at Pitt. But I think he's a really talented guy. And I think the Pitt staff is really excited to get him and add him to the mix and have him compete for a starting job. Now, I think it's important to recognize the challenges in stepping into an offense or a defense and playing right away when you don't have experience. I've been thinking about this a lot lately when we talk about the guys that Pitt lost, the guys from Pitt who went into the transfer portal. That they're going to have, particularly on defense, where you have 4 or 5 guys who were starters or presumably locked into starting roles, and they transfer. And I'm thinking about where they're going, and I'm not sure what their roles are going to be. I'm not sure if they're going to step into a starting job because they're learning a whole new system, and that can take some time. And it can take time to really master, particularly a defensive scheme, well enough that you can be relied upon to be a starter. I mean, that's part of like what we've brought up a lot when we talk about Deion Hayes, Solomon DeShields, DeAndre Jules, and even Bengali Kamara a little bit if you go back to December. We bring up these guys who spent a lot of time learning this defense, and then just as they're coming to their senior season with starting jobs locked up, they walk away to go learn something new for, in the case of Jules or Kamara, learn something new for 8 months before they step on the field. In the case of Hayes or DeShields, learn something new for 4 months and then hope that you've mastered the defense enough to become a starter. So I say all this not as a way to talk about those guys again. It's not any more conversation to be had about that. But when we look at Anglin, I think he's talented enough to play. I think he's talented enough to be on the field and be a contributing member of this defense. But at the same time, he's a guy who's walking into a brand new defensive scheme. And that might be a lot to expect him to walk into a starting job. But I think he'll compete for the starting job. I think he'll be in the mix there with Gandy and Bigelow and Battle and Crumpley and those guys and Lynham. I don't think they recruited Tamon Lynham as a transfer from Nebraska, just looking to bring him in for depth. I don't think they necessarily did that with Jeremiah Anglin either. First transfer portal addition in this spring portal window. I think, you're looking to get a guy who is going to come in and be in the mix of either a starting job or a 2-deep role. And I think that's probably what they're looking for out of Jeremiah Anglin. But I think it's a really big addition. I think he's a really good player. I think he's somebody that if they had signed him as a recruit out of high school, we talk about him pretty highly, the way we often do with defensive backs that Pitt signs out of high school. I'm still really excited to see what Shadarian Harrison can do once he settles into a role on the field. And we've seen, obviously we saw this spring with Jesse Anderson and Cruz Brookins. This staff does well with defensive backs. They are pretty good at finding guys who fit their defense and finding guys who can play here and finding guys who have the things they're looking for. And they've been selective about defensive backs over the years. And Jeremiah Anglin is someone they've wanted for, at least 2 years. I think he took his official visit 2 years ago in June of 2022. And so he's been on the radar for a while. They've known about him for a while. They've known his family for a while. And I think it's a really good addition. And we may get to next year at this time and be like, boy, big deal about that Anglin. He barely even played. I think he'll be a big part of this secondary for the future. Even if he doesn't play next year because he'll be a redshirt freshman, a young guy still learning the defense, I think he can be a big part of their secondary for years to come. They're going to need players to step up every year, and I think he's going to be a guy who steps up. If not in 2024, then certainly in 2025. Now, elsewhere on the portal front, which, of course, if you've been following along on Panther-Lair.com, I think you've got about as up-to-date of information as possible on this situation. Adou Thiero, transfer from Kentucky, looking hard at North Carolina, looking hard at Pitt, and took a visit to Pitt over the weekend. That was a huge deal for Pitt to get Thiero on campus. And, of course, you read about it on Panther-Lair.com. You know the website below, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet, football, basketball, and recruiting. You find it all at Panther-Lair.com and message boards, where not only do you interact with other Pitt fans, but we, like the site staff, we put, those of us who write for the site, we put a lot of news and information on the message boards as well. So it's a great place for interaction with other Pitt fans, but it's also a great place to get info and intel. Obviously we produce a lot of content, we read a lot of articles, but we put a lot of the info on the boards directly, and so you're able to keep up with things there. And if you have been, you've kept up with the fact that Adou Thiero was visiting Pitt this weekend. Now, I mean, further confirmed by him posting on Instagram from his visit, but this really, it's coming down to Pitt in North Carolina. Gotta think this thing gets wrapped up at some point in the near future, I would think. And it's an interesting situation, because I talked about this on Wednesday night during the live stream with Jim, that right before we started the live stream, I was just watching some of Thiero's highlights from Kentucky. And I mean, you could see why he's so coveted by the Pitt staff. You could see how excited they are, or how excited they would be about adding him, because he's such a versatile, outstanding athlete. I mean, he would walk in and be, if he's not the best athlete on the team, just the minute he walks in the door, he's the second best behind Zach Austin. And with Austin and Thiero, Pitt would probably have two of the best athletes in the ACC. I mean, I think those guys, their athleticism, it's through the roof. There are basketball things that you got to work on. You can't just be a great athlete, of course, but those guys have athleticism in spades. And you put them together, it's going to be pretty outstanding if Pitt is able to do that, or has that opportunity to do it. I think Thiero comes in and plays at either the 2 or the 3 or the 4. He could probably play any of those 3 spots. Maybe most likely the 3 and the 4, splitting minutes or pushing for minutes with Zach Austin at the 3. And likewise with Guillermo Diaz-Graham at the 4, potentially pushing for a starting spot. And even if he doesn't, he's going to end up playing a lot if he comes to Pitt. I think he's just that good. And you watch it. It's exciting to watch his highlights, because you see he gets a lot of the things that Zach Austin sometimes gets and should be able to get. Those chaos types of points. And I think if you start adding more guys like that, we keep talking about where's the shooting going to come from? Where's the shooting going to come from? And Thiero can shoot a little bit. The guards can shoot. Guillermo obviously can shoot. I mean, they've got some shooters, but if you add Thiero to this roster that already has Zach Austin on it, you add that explosiveness that I think just makes you so much more dangerous as a roster, top to bottom. That it adds a certain sort of combustibility to this roster of anything can happen. An explosion can happen at any moment. And it really, if you're able to get Thiero onto Pitt's roster this season, and if this comes to pass, I'll probably talk about this kind of thing a lot between now and the time the season happens. But it really comes back to the idea of this team just being very different from what last year's team was and the year before. And I think we felt like last year's team would be very different from the previous season, but it didn't end up being that different. I think there were still a lot of similarities with the way they played 2 years ago and the way they played last season. And obviously, a big part of that was that they still had Blake Hinson. They still had Federico. And whatever you want to say about Federico, carrying over from one year to the next with him as your primary center, your starting center, set a certain tone with how the team played, what they tried to do, and what they were able to do. Even if it meant not having a great interior scoring presence, that was part of their team identity, and that carried over from one year to the next. Blake Hinson and what he did carried over from one year to the next. They didn't necessarily replace that sharpshooter of Greg Elliott, but they were able to get adequate shooting and scoring out of the 3 guards. And so I think last year's team ended up being more like the previous season's team than I expected. But I think this year's team, will be a pretty significant departure, particularly if they add someone like Thiero. Now, it's going to be a significant departure because you're not going to have Blake Hinson. It's going to be a significant departure because you're going to have a center in Cam Corrin who should be able to score and should actually be an offensive threat, which Federico was not. It should be fairly different because I think the primary pairing of Jalen Lowe and Ishmael Leggett is going to look different and operate differently than, Carrington and Lowe last year or Burton and Cummings the year before. It's a different kind of pairing. It's a different types of players. You're still going to have a guard-led team, which I think is ultimately, despite Blake Hinson's role, is ultimately what they were the last 2 seasons. And you're still going to be guard-led. Jalen Lowe is going to be, probably the MVP for this team. Ishmael Leggett's going to be a huge, crucial piece, but it's going to be very different. Just because, almost exclusively because of what you're going to do with the 4 and the 5. How you're going to replace Blake Hinson with Guillermo Diaz-Graham and replace Federico with Cam Corrin. Also, obviously, with being guard-dominated, you add in Damian Dunn and Brandon Cummings as huge pieces of the puzzle. But if you bring in Adou Thiero, all right, if he comes in and he's part of this roster and he's mixing in at the 3 and he's mixing in at the 4, and maybe he's starting in one of those spots, but he's moving around, he's playing different spots. You add an explosiveness that they just have not had. I mean, they obviously had Austin last year. They had Nike Sabandi the year before, but I don't think they had 2 guys like Austin and Thiero together at the same time, playing together or even subbing for each other and keeping that explosiveness on the court pretty much at all times. I mean, you're always going to have that guy who can kind of come out of nowhere and hit a putback dunk. You know what I mean? You're going to have that guy who can sort of come out of nowhere and grab an offensive rebound. You're like, where did that guy come from? You're going to come out of nowhere and get a block shot like Zach Austin did so many times last year. And you can find roles for these guys in the set offense, but they can also do a lot of things outside of that structure. And I think adding Thiero, who is, I would say, a better player than Austin overall, you add him to the mix, and it just, I think it just adds another dimension and adds another element to this team that they didn't have the last 2 years. And so we spend a lot of time talking about how are they going to make up the 3-point shooting. And I think there are answers to that. I think it's a relevant question to ask, and I think there are answers to that question. But I think we also have to look at, yes, how are they going to make up the shooting, but also what things are, like the shooting might be something that last year's team could do better than this year's team. But let's also keep an eye on those things that this year's team might be able to do better than last year's team. And I think that's what gets exciting once you start talking about a player like Thiero potentially joining the roster, is what he can bring that they didn't have, or they didn't have as much of a year ago and 2 years ago. And I think that makes exciting and adds another element and could change this team's fortune. And I think the outlook for this team will change significantly if they do add Adou Thiero. And I think there's a very real possibility of them getting him. I think, I can't sit here and predict that it's going to happen, but I think it's probably, it's more likely than we thought 2 weeks ago. Probably more likely than people outside of Pittsburgh think it is, although it seems like North Carolina people are starting to get pretty concerned about it. And I think it's likely enough that you can, I think you can get your hopes up because, obviously he visited, there's a lot of positive contact there. I think you can get your hopes up, understanding that things still could go sideways, but it certainly looks good for Pitt right now. We'll see where it goes over the next few days. All right, and then the NFL draft, 3 players drafted. It's the 3 we expected. Matt Gonsalves went on Friday, 3rd round to the Indianapolis Colts. Bud Means went in the 5th round on Saturday to the New Orleans Saints, and MJ Devonshire rounded it out with a 7th-round selection by the Las Vegas Raiders. Disappointed for Devonshire to fall like that. I didn't think he was going to be, I probably didn't guess. I probably didn't think he would be drafted above the 5th round. I thought he would be 5 or 6 or 7. I just thought it would probably be 5 or 6. If I had to guess on anything, I probably would have guessed 6, but there are enough people who don't know what they're talking about that analyze the draft. I don't need to add one more to it. Gonsalves, good pick in the 3rd round. New Orleans or Indianapolis traded up to get him. I think that speaks highly of Gonsalves and his projection. Number 79 overall. You can only imagine where he would have been if he had played all last season and been able to work out at the NFL scouting combine. But clearly Indianapolis saw enough of what they liked between Pro Day and the tape that he had. I mean, Gonsalves was really good for Pitt over the course of his career. And I think because he was hurt last year and because, last year was really the first year that he entered the season as an expected starter, we kind of forget how much he actually played. And he played, according to Pro Football Focus, played like more than 1,300 snaps in 2021 and 2022. I think he started 18 games over the course of those those 2 seasons, 21 and 22. And Pitt was 14-4 in the games when he started. The starts included that overtime game against North Carolina in 2021, the Virginia game when they clinched the ACC Coastal Division, the regular season ending win at Syracuse, and then the ACC championship game against Wake Forest. Gonsalves started all of those. And he made some starts in 2020 that were pretty impressive as well. His first career starts only gave up a couple of pressures against Virginia Tech and Clemson, which is nothing to sneeze at. It's unfortunate his career was cut short. It's unfortunate that he wasn't able to play a full season as a senior due to the injury, but he was still a pretty outstanding player. And I think he's going to have a good pro career. Bub Means is a polarizing guy, understandably so. He had some drops in his career. He had some inconsistency in his career. But I've maintained, and I did maintain, I talked a lot about it during the season, that his final 8 games of this past season, once the quarterback situation settled down, he was really good. Final 8 games, he caught 35 passes for 650 yards and 6 touchdowns. Project that to a 12-game season. You're looking at about 52 catches for 975 yards and 9 touchdowns. Expand that out to a 13-game season. Give him the regular season in a bowl game, even though who plays in a bowl game anymore? And, you're looking at a 1,000-yard receiver with double-digit touchdowns. That's really good. And that's the pace he was on. That's how he played in those final 8 games. You say, well, even in those final 8 games, his reception rate was below 60%. He had 60 targets and caught 35 passes. But the thing you have to understand about Bub Means is how he was being used. If you look at all Power 5 receivers who had at least 80 targets last year, his average depth of target was number 1 in the nation, 17.7 yards per target. Number 1 in the nation. Okay? Out of Power 5 receivers with at least 80 targets over the course of the season. So that's what he was working with. He still, despite that, hefty downfield targeting, which is going to lead to fewer completions and a lower reception rate, but some more exciting numbers, he still finished top 30 in yards per route run. He still, I think, was 10th in the nation in contested catches. He was, 15th in the nation in contested catch percentage. And he also lined up out wide as much as anybody in the nation. I mean, he was, getting targeted downfield. He was an outside receiver. He wasn't lining up in line. Oh, and this is among Power 5 receivers with at least 80 targets. He was 7th in that group in how much they lined up outside, 90.5%. Typically, these guys with a ton of targets are lining up in the slot. They're seeing the ball more there. They're getting the quick passes. Bub Means was lining up outside. He was going downfield. He was still getting a ton of targets, and he was catching a high enough percentage to make a big impact and have some of the best numbers in the country. He also had a drop percentage that was near the bottom, one of the lowest. He was top 20 in the nation in drop percentage with 4.7%. And Pro Football Focus only charged him with 2 drops on the season. Bub Means, I think, is a really good player. I think he's a really good prospect. I think there is inconsistency, but there's athleticism, size, and speed to make up for it, to make it worth the risk. Of a 5th round pick, yeah, it's absolutely worth the risk. And he's a Louisiana guy getting to go home, or he spent time in Louisiana. I think it's a good fit. I don't know New Orleans quarterback situation all that well, but Bub Means, I think with good, solid, consistent quarterback play, if he's got somebody who can heave it downfield, he's in a pretty good spot. I think he can make plays. Now, I don't know what his NFL career is going to turn out to. He could get cut out at camp or something, if he's just not consistent enough. But you can see that the physical tools are there and intriguing enough to, again, make it worth the risk, make it worth the gamble of using a 5th round pick on a guy who could, be a real freak out there. because he is a freak. He's a physical freak. That size, speed, athleticism combination doesn't come around all the time. And so if you show at least a little bit of ability as a wide receiver, which he did over the final 8 games of his career, then it's worth it. So good luck to all 3 of those guys. I like those guys a lot. Mac and Salvy's been Bub Means and MJ Devonshire. They were good guys. Good interviews. Always good to talk to. Always good to be around those guys. And so best of luck to them. Hopefully things go well. We'll certainly be following their careers just like we do. Everybody goes into the NFL. So it was a big weekend for Pitt. Lots of stuff going on. 3 draft picks, 1 transfer commitment, and 1 big basketball transfer visit. So a lot happening, and I'm guessing this week is going to be more of the same. We'll talk about it all right here on the Morning Pitt. So make sure you like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you don't miss any of our Pitt video content, these daily Morning Pitt videos. Our weekly live stream that we do every Wednesday night at 8 p.m., me and Jim Hammett getting together for that, and then everything else. We have practice highlights and video press conferences and interviews and all those kinds of things right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So like and subscribe. We'd appreciate that. And and thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching today. Hope you had a great weekend. Hope your Monday gets this week off to a great start for you. And we'll catch up with you tomorrow on the Morning Pit right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.